How you doing, Sioux High AP Biology students? This is Mr. McLeod again. Welcome to the last summer assignment podcast dealing with Chapter 55 in our textbook. Just a reminder that all the work in the summer assignment package is due the day we return to school on September 2nd. So make sure you're doing a minimum of 2 chapters a month so you don't try and cram it all in by the end of August. I know I've said that a lot, but you can't really do that. Not enough time. Okay, Chapter 55 introduced some basic conservation concepts. So get your notes out, something to write with, and let's conserve. Now that sounds a lot better than let's populate, right? All right, biologists have named and described about 1.8 million species. However, they estimate somewhere in the neighborhood of between 10 and 100 million species exist on Earth. Tropical forests contain some of the greatest concentrations of species and are being destroyed at an alarming rate, and humans are rapidly pushing many species towards extinction. Conservation biology seeks to preserve life by integrating several fields. Write that in your notes. Now those fields are ecology, physiology, molecular biology, genetics, and evolutionary biology. Now the rates of species extinction are difficult to determine under natural conditions. However, we do know that the high rate of species extinction is largely a result of ecosystem degradation by humans. Write that down. Now the bottom line here is that we humans are threatening Earth's biodiversity. Now biodiversity has 3 main components. Let's get these in your notes. There's genetic diversity, species diversity, and ecosystem diversity. So get those in your notes. Now, conservation biologists are concerned about species loss because of alarming statistics regarding extinction and biodiversity. Now, I want you to get these stats down. Globally, 12% of birds, 21% of mammals, and 32% of amphibians are threatened with extinction. Now, that extinction may be local or global. Now, make sure you get those stats down. No doubt human activity is reducing ecosystem diversity. Now we think of ecosystem diversity as the variety of ecosystems in the biosphere, so get that in your notes. Ecosystem diversity is the variety of ecosystems in the biosphere. Now more than 50% of wetlands in the contiguous United States have been drained and converted into other ecosystems. Also get that in your notes. 50%. Now we need to realize that the local extinction of one species can have a negative impact on the other species in an ecosystem. Get that down. So the local extinction of one species can have a negative impact on another species. For example, the flying foxes, which are bats that you see here in this picture, are important pollinators and seed dispersers in the Pacific Islands. Remove those flying foxes and the plants suffer. So there's an example of where one species extinction can have an impact on another. Now, species related to agricultural crops can have important genetic qualities. For example, plant breeders bred virus-resistant commercial rice that you see here on the left by crossing it with a wild population. And in the United States, 25% of prescriptions contain substances originally derived from plants. For example, the rosy periwinkle you see here on the right contains alkaloids that inhibit cancer growth. Get those two examples down in your notes. Now, most species loss can be traced to 4 major threats. Let's get those in your notes as well. These 4 threats are habitat destruction, introduced species, overharvesting, and global change. Let's take a closer look at each and their cumulative effects on the ecosystems. There simply is no question that human alteration of habitat is the greatest threat to biodiversity throughout the biosphere. In almost all cases, habitat fragmentation and destruction lead to loss of biodiversity. For example, in Wisconsin, prairie occupies 0.1% of its original area. 0.1% of its original area. While about 93% of coral reefs have been damaged by human activities. Again, get these 2 examples down in your notes for habitat loss. Next, let's talk about introduced species. Introduced species are those that humans move from native locations to new geographic locations. Write that down. Now, without their native predators, parasites, and pathogens, introduced species may spread rapidly. Also write that in your notes. And also write that introduced species that gain a foothold in a new habitat usually disrupt their adopted community. A perfect example of that is the zebra mussels in the Great Lakes. So make sure you have those explanations in that example in your notes. Next, let's talk about overharvesting. Overharvesting is human harvesting of wild plants or animals at rates exceeding the ability of populations of those species to rebound. Get that in your notes. So we're harvesting them at a higher rate than they could rebound. That's called overharvesting. Large organisms with low reproductive rates are especially vulnerable to overharvesting. For example, in this picture, you see that shark populations decline because of harvesting for their fins. That's what you see in this picture. So get that in your notes. Another example of overharvesting is overfishing. Overfishing has decimated wild fish populations. For example, the North Atlantic bluefin tuna population decreased by 80% in the last 10 years. Now let's talk about ways that we're trying to solve these problems. One of them is formation of what we call movement corridors. Movement corridors are a narrow strip of quality habitat connecting otherwise isolated patches. Get that in your notes. Movement corridors promote dispersal and help sustain populations. Now, in areas of heavy human use, artificial corridors are sometimes constructed. Conservation and biologists apply understanding of ecological dynamics in establishing protected areas to slow the loss of biodiversity. Get that in your notes as well. Now here's an excellent example of a movement corridor where the only interruption in the habitat is obviously the creation of this highway. But now on either side of this bridge that you see, and even on top of it, the habitat is maintained. So a great example of a movement corridor. Now, another way is biodiversity hotspots. A biodiversity hotspot is a relatively small area with a great concentration of endemic, E-N-D-E-M-I-C, also known as local species, and many endangered and threatened species. Get that in your notes. biodiversity hotspots are good choices for nature reserves, but identifying them is not always easy. Now here are the locations of some of the Earth's terrestrial and marine biodiversity hotspots. Designation of hotspots is often biased towards saving vertebrates and plants. And hotspots can change with climate change. Get that in your notes. In addition to transporting nutrients from one location to another, humans have added new materials, some of them toxins, to ecosystems. Let's look at 3 ways that happens and get these in your notes. First, the harvest of agricultural crops exports nutrients from the agriculture ecosystem. Write that down. So the harvest of crops exports nutrients from the agricultural ecosystem. Next, agriculture leads to the depletion of nutrients in the soil. So write that down. And then finally, fertilizers add nitrogen and other nutrients to the agriculture ecosystem. So get that down as well. Here you see a phytoplankton bloom arising from nitrogen pollution in the Mississippi basin that leads to what we call a dead zone. Let's kind of take us through that. The first idea is called critical load. So write that in your notes, critical load. Critical load is the amount of added nutrient that can be absorbed by plants without damaging ecosystem integrity. So get that in your notes as critical load. Now let's look at the chain of events that causes what we call phytoplankton blooms, like you see here in the picture. First, nutrients that exceed the critical load leach into the groundwater or run off into aquatic ecosystems. Write that down. So those nutrients leach into the groundwater or run off into the ecosystem. Next, this agricultural runoff and sewage lead to phytoplankton blooms in oceans, much like you see here in this picture. And then lastly, decomposition of phytoplankton blooms causes dead zones due to low oxygen levels. So make sure you get those 3 things in your notes. Okay, next let's talk about biological magnification. Here you see a picture of biological magnification of PCBs, which is a chemical pesticide in a Great Lakes food web. Now, humans release many toxic chemicals, including synthetics previously unknown to nature. Write that down. Now, in some cases, not all, harmful substances persist, which mean they remain in the atmosphere or in the ecosystem for long periods of time. One reason toxins are harmful is that they become more concentrated in successive trophic levels. That's called biological magnification. So again, biological magnification concentrate toxins at higher trophic levels. Get that in your notes. Now, PCBs and many pesticides such as DDT are subject to biological magnification. Now, the herring gulls you see in this picture of the Great Lakes lay eggs with PCB levels 5,000 times greater than in phytoplankton, like is shown here in the picture. Now, in the 1960s, Rachel Carson, who you see here, brought attention to the biomagnification of DDT in birds in her book Silent Spring. DDT was banned in the United States in 1971. And currently, countries with malaria face a trade-off between killing mosquitoes, which we call malarial vectors, and protecting other species through the use of dangerous pesticides. It's no secret that one pressing problem caused by human activities is the rising level of carbon dioxide. Due to the burning of fuels and other human activities, the concentration of CO2 has been steadily increasing. Now, it shouldn't surprise you that most plants grow faster when CO2 concentrations increase. C3 plants, for example, wheat and soybeans, are more limited by carbon dioxide than C4 plants, for example, corn. Now, we'll learn more about C3 and C4 plants in our plant section later during the year. This is a picture of a large-scale experiment on the effects of elevated CO2 concentration that you see here in this picture. The FAX-1 experiment is testing how elevated CO2 influences tree growth, carbon concentration in soils, insect populations, soil moisture, and other factors. The CO2-enriched plots produce more wood than the control plots, though less than expected. The availability of nitrogen and other nutrients appears to limit tree growth and the uptake of CO2. CO2, water vapor, and other greenhouse gases reflect infrared radiation back toward the Earth. This is called the greenhouse effect. Write that down. Now, this effect is important for keeping Earth's surface at a habitable temperature. Increasing concentration of atmospheric CO2 is linked to increasing global temperature. Also get that down. Now, because of that, climatologists can make inferences about past environments and their climates in 3 ways. And let's get these in your notes. Okay, first, pollen and fossil plant records reveal past vegetation. Get that down. Okay, next, carbon dioxide levels are inferred from bubbles trapped in glacial ice. So that's number 2. And then finally, chemical isotope analysis is used to infer past temperature. So get that down as well. Now, northern coniferous forests, which is basically our northern latitudes, and tundra show the strongest effect of global warming. Write that down. For example, in this picture, in 2007, the extent of the Arctic sea ice was the smallest on record. A warming trend would also affect the geographic distribution of precipitation. Also get that down. Now, many organisms may not be able to survive this rapid climate change. So some ecologists support what's called assisted migration. Here's what assisted migration is: the translocation of a species to a favorable habitat beyond its native range. So get that in your notes. Okay, let's look at a few ways we can deal with global warming and get them in your notes. First, global warming can be slowed by reducing energy needs and converting to renewable sources of energy. Get that in your notes. Then, stabilizing carbon dioxide emissions globally will require an international effort. Recent international negotiations have yet to reach a consensus on a global strategy to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Get that in your notes. And lastly, reduced deforestation would also decrease greenhouse gas emissions. Remember, the vast majority of trees cut down in the rainforest are burned. And when they're burned, they release the carbon dioxide that's in the trees, and that increases the global level of CO2. Life on Earth is protected from damaging effects of UV radiation by a protective layer of ozone molecules in the atmosphere. I'm sure you all know that, but if you don't, it might be a good idea to jot that down in your notes. Satellite studies suggest that the ozone layer has been gradually thinning since the mid-1970s. Also get that in your notes. Now, destruction of atmospheric ozone results mainly from CFCs, chlorofluorocarbons, produced by human activity. Now, those CFCs contain chlorine, which reacts with the ozone to make O2. This decrease in the amount of ozone in the atmosphere then reduces its ability to filter out harmful rays. Also get that in your notes. Now this figure shows how chlorine in the atmosphere destroys the ozone. You can see here that it binds with the O2 and doesn't allow the free oxygen to bind with O2 to make O3, therefore reducing the ozone layer amounts. The ozone layer is thinnest over Antarctica and southern Australia, New Zealand, and South America. Ozone levels have decreased 2 to 10% at mid-latitudes during the past 20 years. Write that down. And finally, ozone depletion causes DNA damage in plants and poorer phytoplankton growth. Also get that down. An international agreement signed in 1987 has resulted in a decrease in ozone depletion. Whew. All right, that's it. You have just finished the final podcast and notes for this summer's AP Biology assignment. Woohoo! Make sure you snap a picture of your notes and send them to me for credit. And now go on and enjoy the rest of the summer. Or for some of you, see you tomorrow on the opening day of school. Bye.